In the global race for electric vehicle dominance, China is leading the charge, transforming itself into the epicenter of the EV revolution. Multinational automakers looking to compete there face steep challenges in a market dominated by domestic titans who are bolstered by government backing, relentless innovation, and deep local insights. As Taylor Ogan of Snowball Capital put it in a conversation with me, it's no longer about market dynamics or understanding the Chinese consumer's needs, it's about survival. According to this CEO of the green and high-technology hedge fund, the stakes are now much higher for global EV companies than before. From my interviews with industry experts and research on the Chinese economy as a fellow at Asia Society Policy Institute, success in this competitive, booming market demands a multi-pronged strategy. Leaders will have to form strategic alliances with local players in China to enhance technological integration and navigate regulatory complexities, enable rapid, localized innovation with hefty and smart investments in R&D, and build a strong local identity through tailored marketing to resonate with Chinese consumers. Title 1: Forming strategic partnerships beyond traditional joint ventures. Forming strategic alliances with local firms can unlock doors that might otherwise remain closed for a global automaker. As a longtime EV industry analyst told me, no one anticipated the speed at which new energy vehicle adoption is increasing in China. It's far outpacing expectations, so global players have to seek local partnerships that not only provide market access but also accelerate their transition to fully electric platforms. However, such alliances with local firms are not a panacea. Renault's ill-fated venture with Dongfeng serves as a cautionary tale. Despite establishing a joint venture in 2013, Renault faced numerous challenges such as product misalignment and slow adaptation. Their City KZE, based on an older Indian platform, fell flat in a market craving cutting-edge technology. This misstep, coupled with a focus on crowded coastal markets instead of leveraging their initial success in less urbanized regions, led to Renault's retreat from the Chinese market. In contrast, Ford's partnership with battery maker CATL to license the latter's next-gen technology and build up its local production in Michigan is a smarter strategic move in attempting to lower critical costs and accelerate the transition to fully electric platforms, although execution challenges remain. This collaboration allows Ford to move beyond traditional joint ventures, instead licensing CATL's more efficient lithium iron phosphate battery technology to reduce reliance on the expensive nickel manganese cobalt batteries while increasing EV production capability and profitability. Ford's approach reflects a broader strategy among global automakers to tap into China's dominant position in the battery supply chain, forming strategic partnerships to innovate and stay competitive in the EV space both globally and within China. Tesla's collaboration with Baidu further exemplifies how strategic alliances can ease regulatory compliance difficulties and enhance technological integration. By tapping into Baidu's expertise in AI and high-definition mapping, Tesla successfully introduced its full self-driving feature to China, navigating a complex regulatory landscape while boosting its competitive edge. This partnership enabled Tesla to meet Chinese standards for keeping sensitive mapping data within the country, highlighting the crucial role of local expertise in overcoming regulatory challenges. While not a cure-all, as Pedro Pacheco, a VP analyst at Gartner notes, such alliances are crucial for addressing foreign automakers' gaps in software and battery electric vehicle technology. Title 2: Navigating the Regulatory Labyrinth. Navigating China's regulatory landscape is a complex yet critical aspect of succeeding in its burgeoning EV market. Although the Chinese government has a strong commitment to nurturing its domestic EV industry through innovation-friendly policies, creating opportunities for global players alike, regulatory uncertainties persist. For foreign automakers, strategic engagement with authorities is crucial to anticipate policy shifts and align their strategies with national priorities. Kyle Chan, a researcher at Princeton University, observes that global automakers should capitalize on the substantial public and private investments already infused into China's domestic EV supply chain. This strategy not only ensures regulatory compliance but also taps into the policy support that empowers Chinese EV manufacturers. Ford's proactive approach offers a valuable case study. By aligning its offerings with national objectives like emissions reduction and vehicle safety, and engaging actively in policy dialogues, Ford has skillfully leveraged government incentives to solidify its market position. The creation of a Skunk Works team, featuring top engineers from Tesla and Apple, underscores the company's dedication to crafting efficient and affordable EV platforms tailored to China's unique demands. In stark contrast, Honda's slower adaptation from their traditional strength in internal combustion engines led to missed opportunities to benefit from government incentives aimed at early adopters. This mistake cost Honda a diminished market presence, struggling to compete with both local and foreign rivals who were quicker to align with China's strategic directions. Gartner's Pacheco adds that while global automakers and original equipment manufacturers that provide parts or components for a final vehicle have navigated regulatory challenges in other markets, China's rapid evolution demands an even greater level of agility and prioritization. To effectively navigate the Chinese EV market, global companies must cultivate robust relationships with both local and national authorities, aligning their strategies with the country's ambitions in green technology and urban mobility. This type of engagement not only offers valuable insights into potential policy shifts but also allows companies to shape policy discussions. Participation in government-led initiatives, such as autonomous vehicle pilots and smart infrastructure projects, enhances global players' likelihood of integration into China's dynamic industrial ecosystem. They should also watch out for new opportunities from the expanding low-altitude economy, which is bolstered by investments like the one from CATL in Autoflight and Wuhan's $2.4 billion bet on smart infrastructure projects. For global automakers, China's strong support for autonomous vehicle technologies presents unparalleled innovation opportunities. The government's aggressive promotion of driverless technology development in cities like Shenzhen and Jinan creates a fertile ground for experimenting. Tesla, by strategically aligning its FSD system with China's policy objectives, has markedly accelerated its development. With over 1.6 billion miles logged, Tesla's FSD establishes a benchmark that Chinese firms like Baidu are eager to meet and exceed, as evidenced by Baidu's expanding fleet of self-driving taxis. By forging partnerships with local tech firms and capitalizing on China's forward-looking policy initiatives, Tesla has not only met stringent regulatory standards but also secured its place at the leading edge of autonomous driving innovation. Title 3: Enabling Rapid Innovation. In China, standing still is not an option. Companies like BYD, NIO, and Li Auto thrive by constantly pushing the envelope in battery technology, vehicle connectivity, and autonomous driving capabilities. BYD's vertically integrated model, producing most components in-house paired with robust R&D, has fueled rapid innovation, yielding significant cost and efficiency advantages. Taylor Ogan highlights BYD's expansive R&D team as a key differentiator, especially in software and AI, where foreign automakers often lag. To keep pace, global players must prioritize local R&D. Volkswagen's innovation hubs in China exemplify how foreign automakers can tap into the local ecosystem, acting as listening posts to swiftly identify and respond to emerging trends and consumer preferences. BMW's success with its China-specific 5 Series sedan also demonstrates the power of deep localization and innovation. By integrating extended wheelbases, culturally resonant design elements like illuminated Chinese characters, and advanced technology tailored to Chinese traffic conditions, BMW effectively resonated with local consumers. Agility is crucial in this dynamic market, too. NIO's practice of continuous iteration, through frequent over-the-air updates and user feedback integration, exemplifies the responsiveness needed for success in China. Global automakers can also leverage their expertise to drive innovation. Companies like Tesla and BMW, renowned for their pioneering technologies and playing a leading role in setting industry standards, can differentiate themselves with advanced features and designs, offering unique value propositions to customers in China. By integrating cutting-edge technologies across their global operations, they strive to maintain a competitive advantage over local competitors. Title 4: Cultivating a Positive Local Identity. Establishing a strong local presence in China requires more than mere infrastructure. It demands a brand identity that truly resonates with Chinese consumers. As Ivy Yang, founder of Wavelet Strategy notes, Chinese consumers can sometimes be fickle and demanding, their tastes reshaping the EV market constantly. Catering to these evolving preferences, ranging from in-car karaoke to shiatsu massage seats, has shifted EV sales from being driven primarily by government incentives to being led by consumer demand. Building brand recognition in China goes beyond traditional marketing efforts. It requires tailored strategies that help foster a deeper, more interactive connection, such as direct engagement with the audience through social media and digital platforms. Audi and Cadillac's innovative outreach to food delivery drivers illustrates this approach. By engaging with these workers in viral short videos, these automakers seamlessly integrated their products into the daily fabric of Chinese life. Through sponsorships and collaborations, they demonstrated a common touch, appealing to local culture while showcasing their vehicles' practicality and reliability in challenging urban settings. Global automakers can also draw valuable lessons from the success of Chinese players in international markets. In Saudi Arabia, for instance, Chinese companies tailored their internal combustion engine vehicles to withstand the extreme heat and provided comprehensive after-sales support, earning favorable consumer feedback. Brands like Chang'an have strategically aligned themselves with Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030, targeting new female drivers with vehicles that emphasize safety and modern design. This approach of aligning product offerings with emerging market needs and social trends has allowed them to overcome initial skepticism and build strong brand recognitions, paving the way for their electric models. As Kyle Chan suggests, this exchange of knowledge can be mutually beneficial. By forming strategic partnerships with Chinese firms, global automakers can leverage their international expertise to aid the global expansion of Chinese companies, exemplified by Leapmotor's collaboration with Stellantis in Europe. Title 5: The Road Ahead. To thrive in China's EV market, global automakers must forge strategic partnerships to pursue technological integration and navigate regulatory landscape, invest in local R&D for rapid innovation, and cultivate a brand identity that resonates with Chinese consumers. China's EV market is not just another battleground, it's where the future of transportation technologies, like autonomous driving and electric vehicles, is being shaped. The stakes are high, but so are the potential rewards for those who can think locally, innovate rapidly, and execute flawlessly in the world's most dynamic EV market. As China continues to shape the global EV landscape, the strategies developed and refined there will likely become blueprints for success in the broader international automotive industry.
大家好，欢迎关注华尔街电视频道。本视频录制时间为美东时间10月3日。这一期热点深度关注一个紧迫的问题：这么大力度的救市计划，说明经济差到爆。在全球经济环境变化的影响下，中国的增长目标似乎变得越来越遥不可及。尽管中国政府希望今年的增长能达到 5%， 但消费者支出疲软、房地产市场不稳定以及全球对中国商品的抵制，无疑让这一目标变得充满挑战。随着秋季的到来，许多国际银行已经预测中国将无法达成这一目标，通胀压力持续升高，消费者信心降至近1年半来的低点。面对这种情况，中国政府不得不依赖制造业和出口来推动经济复苏，但专家们对于财政策和货币政策的实际效果产生了质疑。我们还将探讨中国经济下滑的原因，包括房地产市场的崩溃和消费者支出的低迷。这不仅影响了国内经济，还对全球市场造成了连锁反应，许多国家的经济增长都与中国息息相关。最重要的是，中国政府已经开始采取一系列刺激措施，希望能够挽回经济下滑的局面。然而，这些措施的效果仍然不确定。在面对持续的通缩压力和债务危机的情况下，中国是否能够摆脱这种失落的10年的阴影？请大家继续收看详细内容。本期特别节目基于彭博社 Bloomberg 的一篇深度报道，分析了中国经济在当前全球经济格局下的状态，以及可能的未来发展轨迹。中国的经济增长目标设定为今年达到约 5%， 然而目前的经济环境对这一目标提出了严峻挑战。消费者支出疲软， 全球市场对中国产品的抵制，以及不稳定的房地产市场，使得中国的经济增长之路充满了不确定性。在9月，随着目标实现的希望逐渐渺茫，北京出台了一系列刺激措施，包括降息，希望能扭转局面。然而，成功并不确定。持续的通缩压力也引发了关于世界第2大经济体是否会步入日本是经济停滞的讨论。今年秋季，大多数国际银行都预计中国无法实现其年度经济增长目标，通缩压力愈发明显，新房价格跌幅创下2014年以来最大，而消费者信心跌至1年多以来的最低点。政府继续依赖制造业和出口作为恢复经济的驱动力。然而，只有不到1/5%的经济学家认为2024年中国国内生产总值 GDP 能达到5%的增长。包括美国银行在内的多个金融机构对财政和货币政策为何未能有效刺激国内需求表示质疑。尽管出口达到近2年最高值，北京仍面临来自各国对中国产品的抵制压力。财政部副部长廖明等高官则为中国的工业实力进行辩护，称其有助于全球应对气候变化和遏制通胀。全球经济对中国的依赖程度，使得其经济波动对世界其他地区产生重大影响。国际货币基金组织 IMF 预测，直到2028年，中国仍将是全球增长的主要贡献者，份额预计是美国的2倍。巴西和澳大利亚等矿产出口国对中国基础设施和房地产投资的波动尤为敏感。例如，中国国内经济下滑导致过多的钢铁供过于求，推动出口导致全球价格下跌，从而使智利等国家的公司陷入困境。中国需求疲软也影响了从 Stellantis、MV 到阿斯顿、马丁等汽车制造商的盈利能力。同时，越来越节俭的消费者导致星巴克和雅诗兰黛等全球品牌的销售额大幅下滑。中国经济的挑战遍布多个领域。截至9月，制造业活动自2023年4月以来大多处于收缩状态，只有3个月例外。美国试图将中国切断于先进半导体和其他技术的供应之外，这一策略被美国官员称为战略竞争，而中国则指责为遏制。国内信心变得如此脆弱，以至于今年夏天，中国银行对实体经济的贷款出现19年来首次萎缩，负债累累的地方政府的资产负债表也受到了房地产价格下滑的打击，土地销售收入以创纪录的速度下降，使得在经济急需财政支持的情况下，逆转预算支出的下降变得更加困难。在疫情后，原本预期消费会出现报复性消费增长，但实际情况却未能达到预期，人们对经济增长疲软带来的失业和收入问题感到担忧。多年持续的地产危机导致家庭财富估计减少了18万亿美元，促使人们倾向于储蓄而非消费，推动中国进入自1999年以来最长的通缩期。9月的一个主要假期期间，中国消费略有上升，这显示家庭支出回升仍有很长的路要走。失业问题依然令人担忧，对大科技公司的监管打击进一步剥夺了许多年轻有抱负的毕业生的就业机会。青年失业率在8月连续第2个月上涨，达到今年以来的最高水平。房地产一直是中国经济增长的主要引擎。然而，自从习近平主席10年前上台以来，政府在2020年试图打击负债累累的开发商，以降低金融系统风险，这导致房价下跌，许多较弱的公司违约，许多开发商停止了已经出售但尚未交付的房屋建设，促使一些人停止支付抵押贷款。这一动荡是对许多长期将房地产视为稳健投资的中国人的警示。到2024年，这种痛苦仍在继续，这是自2022年初以来下降趋势的延续。今年5月，中国推出其最广泛的房地产市场复苏尝试，然而进展缓慢。其计划包括提供3000亿元人民币中央银行资金，帮助政府支持的公司从开发商手中购买未售出的房屋。考虑到地方政府对该计划经济回报的吸引力有限，只有少数超过200个城市响应中央政府的号召，帮助吸收过剩住房。在经济政策方面，中国政府在长期显得不愿采取更激进措施后，政治局在9月的会议上承诺追求年度经济目标，并阻止房地产市场下滑。与中央银行协调行动，政府已经降低利率，解锁流动性以鼓励银行贷款，并承诺提供高达3400亿美元以提振中国股市。 最新政策推动的重点是稳定房地产行业，包括降低现有抵押贷款利率和放宽住房市场限制。根据彭博经济的估计，刺激方案可能在未来4个季度内提升经济增长1至1.1个百分点，今年的刺激效果大约为20个基点。然而，最新一轮刺激能否真正解决问题仍是未知数。迅速的刺激措施意味着中国可能接近实现5%的增长目标，并以乐观的态度进入2025年。但要克服通缩并逆转房地产市场的低迷，将是一个巨大的挑战。这在很大程度上取决于政策制定者决定投入的财政资源规模。不断升级的贸易争端也有可能削弱增长，而且住房的巨大过剩意味着即便有房地产刺激，也需要一段时间才能转化为实际建设，甚至可能根本无法实现。随着人口减少和城市化进程放缓，推动住房需求的结构性因素减少，结果是在解决债务问题的过程中，中国可能面临与日本所谓失去的10年相似的长期增长疲软。在节目结束前，我们还将关注国际社会对此的看法和影响。彭博社首席经济学家汤姆·奥里克在新经济论坛上与主要投资专家探讨了中国面临的日本化风险。我们还将参考更多的快速解说，深入探讨中国的持续通缩问题、房地产乱局的影响，以及习近平的高质量发展运动。另一边，从南华早报的消息中得知，中国政府在今年年初设定了5%的年度增长目标，这个目标本来就像是高山仰止。尽管之前预测5%的 GDP 增长需要投资增长达到 5.3%， 以抵消消费放缓和房地产投资锐减的影响，然而那些乐观的计算随着时间的推移变得有些摇摇欲坠。最新的数据显示，今年1月至8月，中国的消费增长以消费品零售额来衡量，仅达到 3.4%， 固定资产投资的增长也同样疲软。虽然进出口增长了大约 8%， 但只占国内生产总值的 2.5%， 对整体经济贡献微乎其微。过去几年，中国的 GDP 增长逐渐下降，从2010年的 10.6% 一路跌至去年的 5.2%。这就像是一位曾经在田径赛场上飞奔的运动员，如今却需要拄着拐杖慢慢走。这种情势让人不禁想起一句老话，还有什么比失去一个经济奇迹更令人心痛的呢？然而，经济学家们却信心满满地认为，智慧的宏观经济政策、面向市场的改革和真正的开放承诺，仍能让中国的经济保持在 5% 到 6% 的稳定增长范围内。长期以来，中国的经济学家们一直在激烈讨论，到底是应该采取更扩张性的财政和货币政策来刺激 GDP 增长，还是应该着眼于消除过剩产能的结构性改革。不过，面对今年的经济疲态，大多数人的意见似乎开始趋于一致。9月24日，中国人民银行下调了商业银行的存款准备金率 0.5个百分点，基准政策利率也下调了 0.2个百分点。为了稳定房地产市场，央行还将存量房贷利率下调了 0.5个百分点，并降低了2套房的最低首付比例。这一系列措施迅速点燃了股票市场的火焰，当日上海和深圳的股市分别上涨了 4.2% 和 4.4%。然而，当经济陷入流动性陷阱时，仅靠央行是远远不够的，这时候就需要政府的强势介入。于是，公众的目光转向财政部。随着 GDP 增长放缓，经济学家们越来越呼吁政府推出大规模的刺激计划。去年，中国的赤字占 GDP 的比率约为 3%， 而债务占 GDP 的比率是 24%， 这说明政府完全有能力采取扩张性的财政政策。当然，并不是所有人都认同这一评估。根据惠誉评级的估计，今年中国的政府预算赤字将达到 GDP 的 7.1%， 而债务占 GDP 的比率将升至 61.3%。值得注意的是，中国的财政风险可能比这些数字显示的更大，考虑到政府对地方政府融资平台的隐性支持。尽管如此，中国的财政资源相比其他主要经济体仍显得相当雄厚。此外，中国的高储蓄率帮助它维持近3万亿美元的国际投资盈余。即便 GDP 增长放缓，它依然足以支付政府债务的利息。即使拥有这些优势，仅靠央行的行动仍不足以重振中国经济。 这就好比那位失去拐杖的运动员，仍需要一双结实的鞋子，才能重新在赛道上奔跑。然而，2024年也只剩下3个月的时间，要是行动过于匆忙，可能适得其反。政府应该尽快宣布一项全面的大规模刺激计划，以利用公告效应来提振士气，提升公众信心。政策制定者应该汲取2009年的教训，当时中国推出了4万亿元的刺激计划，以缓解全球金融危机的影响。通过采取类似大胆的财政和货币政策，同时将可能的副作用降至最低，中国可以重振经济，为2024年及以后的增长注入动力。然而，当我们回顾这些政策的过程时，不禁让人想起那句话：别急着庆祝还不成熟的胜利。经济学家报道指出，仅靠股市的壮观反弹还不足以重启经济。中国的政策制定者终于眨了眨眼，经过18个月的零星刺激和经济情绪恶化后，终于迎来了一次迟来的政策转折。官员释放了一系列宽松措施，似乎表明他们的忍耐极限已经达到了。股票市场的表现令人惊喜。当香港市场在10月2日的公共假期后重新开盘时，股市上涨了超过 6%， 在短短6个交易日内涨幅超过 20%。但中国要摆脱通缩陷阱，还需要更多的刺激措施。这种情绪的转变始于央行。9月24日，人民银行在美联储放松政策后，立即下调了利率，放宽了银行存款准备金要求，并降低了现有房贷的成本，还推出了新工具来刺激股市。2天后，中国共产党承诺将更加努力地遏制房地产市场的下滑，并更有力地应对经济放缓。据媒体报道，中央政府可能很快会再借款2万亿元人民币，约2850亿美元，相当于 GDP 的 1.5%。这笔资金的一半将帮助地方政府处理债务问题，另一半则将帮助消费者，包括直接向多子女家庭发放补助。这些措施代表了一种风格和紧迫性上的长期变化。长期以来，政府似乎害怕做得太多，而不是太少，以帮助经济。习近平作为中国的领导人，一直不屑于给予家庭慷慨的补助，他担心这会削弱他们的自立能力。国家领导人未能有效处理国家的房地产低迷，让地方城市各自为政，缺乏北京足够的支持。地方政府经费紧张，他们削减开支，并对企业施压以收取费用和补税，加剧了经济放缓。相比过去的刺激努力，最新的措施在沟通和协调上做得更好，并更针对消费者。但在之前的迟缓之后，官员们将面对重振信心和支出的艰巨任务。即便所有报道的财政措施都得到确认，他们的规模仍不够。要重振增长和通胀，许多经济学家认为中国需要7万亿到10万亿元人民币的刺激，若分2年实施，这将占 GDP 的 2.5% 至 4%。官员们还必须说明他们将如何阻止房地产低迷。这可能需要中央政府来保证交付已售但未完工的房产。此外，还需要处理那些已完工但未售出的空置楼房。北京希望国有企业购买这些房屋，并将其转为可负担住房，但在这方面的资金支持仍然不够。倘若刺激规模够大，中国经济有望摆脱通缩困境。随着时间的推移，消费者可能会有足够的信心去消费，而企业则会重新开始投资。这次的刺激措施可能不会像以往那样点燃商品市场，而是更专注于消费者。倘若中国家庭能购买更多的汽车和其他制成品，那么这些商品流入海外市场的数量可能会减少，这对于那些担心中国竞争的市场来说，无疑是一丝安慰。总之，这场经济刺激的盛宴虽然才刚刚开始，但其中的曲折、挑战和潜在的机遇，无疑将成为未来经济故事中的重要篇章。让我们拭目以待，中国这位曾经的经济奇迹，能否再次在全球舞台上写下辉煌的新篇章？
好了，以上就是今天热点深度所有内容，更多资讯可以关注六度简报网站，网址是6dobrief.com，在上面各位可以订阅各类符合您喜好的简报新闻，有免费套餐，也有更加专业的付费套餐供大家选择。今天的视频就到这里，我们下个视频再见。
观众朋友，大家好，欢迎收看今天的新风视线。中国股市近期的强劲反弹正引发海外投资者情绪的重大转变，海外对冲基金正以创纪录的速度涌入中国股市，海外大型机构投资者也似乎逐步走出了观望情绪，准备再次压住中国。最近一项调查研究发现，许多原本早已远离中国市场的投资者正在返回，部分对冲基金甚至是不选股全部买入。有机构认为方向只有一个，那就是上涨。在一系列利好政策的刺激下，上证指数9月累计上涨17%，深圳成指涨26%，创业板跳涨38%，创下单月涨幅的历史记录。港股方面，恒生指数9月也累计上涨18%，恒生科技指数上涨33%。强劲的市场表现叠加强刺激的预期，正在悄然改变海外投资者对中国股市的态度。根据彭博社的采访调研，来自美国、新加坡、澳大利亚的对冲基金都在建立中国的看涨头寸，压住京东等消费股的反弹。而管理着5000亿英镑的苏格兰知名投资公司阿伯丁表示，虽然公司正在有选择地购买中国股票，并且在等待更加详细的财政刺激计划，但是总体而言，他们相信中国市场的上行空间将会大于下行空间。还有一些看好中国的外国基金经理则认为，中国股票的低估值与不断改善的政策之间现在存在着巨大脱节，再加上美国降息刺激全球需求，而中国出口则前景良好，因此中国现在可以投资。而那些不看好中国的大空头们，据报道在本次行情中已经累计亏损69亿美元，抹去了空头今年迄今约37亿美元的收益，并且导致目前账面损失约32亿美元。其中阿里巴巴和京东的股价暴涨，令做空的投资者损失惨重。近5天来，阿里股价涨了近20%。全球最大的对冲基金桥水基金的创办人达里奥经常点评中国经济。这一次他说，过去1周是重要的1周，如果中国拿出的实际措施比承诺要多得多，那么意味着中国经济将走向一个历史性的转折点。他将中国的做法与2012年欧洲央行前行长德拉吉不惜一切代价捍卫欧元的时刻相提并论。达利奥近日在社交媒体领英发表文章说，这是重要的1周，它可能会被载入市场经济的史册，只要中国的政策制定者能够继续竭尽所能。中国官方上周连续抛出多项重磅经济提振措施，包括下调关键政策利率，向金融市场提供长期流动性约1万亿元，降低存量房贷利率0.5个百分点，以及将全国房贷最低首付比例从25%下调至15%等等。一揽子经济刺激措施带动陆港股市持续多日大涨。达利奥在文章中将中国的做法与2012年欧洲前央行行长德拉吉不惜一切代价捍卫岌岌可危的欧元时刻相提并论。德拉吉的讲话最终实现了欧债危机的解决。达里奥曾经多次与中国高层领导人会晤，他在文章中说，中国正处于房地产泡沫破灭、地方政府债务上升的十字入口，中国未来要么陷入与日本当年类似的经济低迷，要么就是成功的削减了债务，避免危机。而为了实现漂亮的去杠杆，中国需要重组不良资产以及发行更多的货币，尽量在不过于刺激通胀的情况下减轻偿债负担。达利奥说，上周已经看到了一些大手笔的刺激措施，而且从官方的承诺中预计接下来还会有高强度的政策刺激，对于中国资产价格的上涨将会再次大有帮助。而很多股民对于近期的行情可以说是意犹未尽，宁愿是国庆不放假，担心这轮好行情会被打断。但业界现在普遍认为，这一次股市可能不会是昙花一现的上涨。首先，这轮刺激措施手笔大，涉及面广，程度超预期；其次是救市决心强。以股市为例，央行行长潘功胜上周在发布会上称，提振股市工具的首期数千亿元，如果效果好，后期还会再来第二个、第三个数千亿。言下之意，官方已经做好了加码准备，有一种不惜一切代价救活经济的态势。 此外，政策方向制定之后落实也算很快。政治局会议刚明确指示要促进楼市止跌回稳，一线城市北上广深立刻就在11长假前宣布松绑限购政策。从之前的滴灌式的政策支持到大刀阔斧的刺激政策，北京对应经济问题的做法发生了明显的转变。有消息人士透露，官方还在酝酿发行2万亿元特别国债，支持消费，给二胎家庭补贴，不排除采取一些福利主义的政策。那么是什么促使一直滴灌式的官方突然开始有了紧迫感呢？最直观的压力相信来自于经济数据。今年前8个月的各项经济指标都在不断的拉警报，各大投行近期纷纷下调中国经济增长预测。也就是说，如果官方再不做些什么，几乎等于是放弃了今年5%左右的增长目标。而进入了衰退周期是另一个压力，一旦中国进入衰退，打破惯性的难度将会越来越大，因此北京必须充分发力，才能够避免走上日本的老路。而现在的问题是，政策已经起了效果，但是这轮热度会持续多久呢？有很多老股民联想到2015年那一轮牛市之后极其惨烈的股灾，他们私下表示，脱离基本面的暴冲是不可持续的。新加坡联合早报的中国新闻主任杨丹旭则指出，真正要修复市场信心，改善基本面，北京还需要让民营企业家有更大的安全感，创造公平的竞争环境，改革财税政策，摆脱对土地的依赖，推高居民收入，让民众愿意花钱，有钱可花等等。国务院发展研究中心原副主任刘世锦不久前在一场论坛上呼吁北京官方要推出一揽子刺激政策加上改革的振兴方案，而如今刺激政策已经启动，还欠缺的就是有力度的改革措施，而这则需要北京高层更加大的魄力。以上就是今天新风视线的全部内容，感谢您的收看，这里是华尔街电视，如果喜欢记得点赞并且订阅我们的频道，我们下期节目再见。
各位充满求知欲的观众朋友们，大家好。今天我们要来探讨一个热门话题：2024年美国总统大选。这场选战可谓史无前例，究竟唐纳德·川普能否重返白宫，亦或是贺锦丽将突破性别藩篱，成为美国首位女总统？让我们直捣黄龙，一探究竟。这场选战利害关系重大，竞争激烈，从华府熙攘的街头，到华尔街的金融脉动，再到矽谷的科技巨头，全美各地都为之沸腾。首先，我们来谈谈川普。不论您是支持还是反对，都无法忽视他的存在。他的支持者一如既往的热情拥戴，他已让美国再次伟大的承诺激荡着选民基础。但且慢，贺锦丽可不是省油的灯。身为现任副总统，他一直处于政治漩涡的中心。他对美国的愿景是进步的、包容的，具有前瞻性的。他会是打破那道最高、最坚硬玻璃天花板的人吗？现在，让我们不要忘记那些不被看好的候选人。竞选过程中总会有惊喜，独立候选人、第三势力以及黑马都有可能以意想不到的方式扭转局势。这场竞赛鹿死谁手尚未可知，那么谁会赢得胜利呢？答案并不容易。民意调查、辩论和舆论每天都在变化。可以肯定的是，2024年大选注定将成为历史性的一刻。请持续关注我们的报道，我们将为您带来每一次转折的最新消息。从竞选活动到投票所，我将为您带来第一线的最新报道。别忘了点赞、订阅，并开启通知铃铛，以获得更多突发新闻和深入分析。感谢您收看美国简报，下次见。请在 YouTube 上关注我们美国简报。
欢迎来到 六度解析新闻背后的多维思考，带你洞悉头条背后的世界。在今日华尔街频道的六度解析中，我们将深入探究时事热点，为你揭开新闻背后的真相。在这个信息泛滥、真相难觅的时代，六度解析应运而生。我运用海量数据、人工智能整合以及专家观点，层层剥析每个故事，通过实时背景数据挖掘，确保你获得全面的新闻资讯。然而，我们关注的不仅仅是数据，更重要的是将它们串联起来。我将分析多方视角，揭示隐藏的脉络，为你提供单一媒体常常忽略的背景信息。无论是政治、经济，还是全球事务，我都将为你带来最具洞察力的分析。试想一下，拥有洞悉全局的能力，做出明智的决策，参与有意义的讨论，这就是六度解析带给你的价值。它不仅仅是新闻分析，更是一种赋能的工具。加入今日华尔街的六度解析，共同探索头条背后的故事。你通往深度理解的旅程，从这里开始。不要只是阅读新闻，要解码新闻，理解新闻，活出新闻。这一切尽在六度解析。立即订阅，不错过任何真知灼见。因为了解真相仅仅是个开始。
我们在抓捕的过程中，首先需要克服疫情符合疫情管理的要求。第二的话，我们在抓捕的过程需要夜以继日的进行蹲守。但是所有的辛苦，在我们抓到犯罪嫌疑人的时候，一切的辛苦都是值得的。
大家好，欢迎关注华尔街电视频道。本视频录制时间为美东时间10月1日。刚才视频里的和现在画面上的这位壮汉叫做段鹏。这期热点深度关注一起震撼人心的事件。在2024年中国国庆假期的第一天，湖南邵阳的公安系统内部发生了一起惊人的枪击事件。两位主角李长月和段鹏成为了互联网上的热门话题。根据传言，邵阳市公安局局长李长月竟然在一次升旗仪式中被他的下属特警副大队长段鹏近距离枪杀。这一消息迅速在社交媒体上引发了热议，但随即遭到了全面封杀，相关报道也被大量删除。面对如此敏感的事件，网民们不禁开始怀疑背后的真相。据报道，段鹏开枪的原因包括职位的争斗、假期被迫取消，以及过去的恩怨，这一切都在他枪口下交织成了一场悲剧。而李长月作为市政府的高层，曾经的光环，如今却成了他遭遇不幸的背景。在这起事件中，段鹏的背景同样引人关注，他曾被评为全国公安机关成绩突出青年民警，却在一瞬间成为了枪击案的主角。这一切究竟是什么原因导致的？背后又隐藏着哪些不为人知的秘密？请大家继续收看详细内容，了解这起事件的更多内幕。2024年中国国庆假期第一天，在互联网上两个名字火了，一个名字叫李长月。根据中国官方网站，李长月为现任邵阳市人民政府党组成员、副市长，市公安局党委书记、局长。另一个名字叫段鹏，他是邵阳市公安局巡特警支队特警2大队副大队长。网络有传闻称，10月1日，湖南邵阳市公安局长李长月被特警副大队长段鹏近距离枪杀。据悉，事件发生在10月1日，也就是国庆节的第一天。涉事的两个人物分别是李长月和段鹏。李长月是邵阳市人民政府党组成员、副市长，兼任市公安局党委书记、局长。而段鹏则是邵阳市公安局巡特警支队特警2大队副大队长。网络传闻称，李长月被段鹏近距离枪杀。这一消息在大陆网络上迅速传播，但立刻遭到全面封禁。尽管如此，相关的信息仍然通过社交平台的自动联想功能有所显现。这些关键字包括邵阳市公安局、邵阳开枪、邵阳公安局长被杀等。某些自媒体和网络用户进一步补充了事件的细节。据称，段鹏在事发当日早上，先是在朋友圈晒出自己的所有荣誉，然后在升旗仪式上对李长月开枪。网传消息还指出，段鹏在开枪后试图自杀，但未成功。传闻给出的动机是多方面的，包括职务晋升问题、被迫取消休假，以及与李长月在处理某个案件上积怨已久。官方渠道尚未证实这一事件的真实性，但网络上对段鹏的报道已被大量删除。 在谷歌等搜索引擎上还能找到相关信息，但链接多数已显示404错误。不过，百度百科上的段鹏介绍页面仍然存在。段鹏在公安系统内是个成绩斐然的年轻警官。据警察与法制官网报道，段鹏曾被评为全国公安机关成绩突出的青年民警。他身高 1.92 米，体重100公斤，是邵阳市公安队伍中体型最为魁梧的一员。段鹏从警12年以来，工作表现一直非常突出，先后荣立个人3等功4次，嘉奖4次。2021年还获得了邵阳市青年54奖章。段鹏在特警支队的表现更是可圈可点。2011年，他参加湖南省首届公安系统散打擂台赛，荣获85公斤以上级别亚军。2021年，他获得了邵阳市青年54奖章。2022年则被评为全国公安机关成绩突出的青年民警。段鹏曾多次在抗洪抢险、抓捕毒枭、新冠疫情防控等工作中表现出色。例如，在一次抗洪抢险中，段鹏和战友成功转移了数百名被困群众。在一次抓捕毒枭的行动中，段鹏凭借惊人的勇气和反应速度，用身体压住了持枪毒枭。在疫情期间，他还主动请缨，带领突击队员在医院重点隔离区执勤，无畏地面对病毒威胁。段鹏的同事和上级对他的评价也很高。特警2大队大队长王鹏曾风趣地评价段鹏四肢发达，头脑不简单，并称赞他在复杂地形中带领队伍成功完成任务的机智表现。然而，这样一个在警界备受认可的优秀警官，为何会做出如此极端的举动？网络上给出的解释是多方面的。首先，段鹏原本有望被提升为正大队长，但李长月上任后因收受贿赂而将这一职务给了他人。其次，段鹏计划在11期间带全家外出旅游，但被迫取消休假。最后，段鹏与李长月在处理某个案件时产生了矛盾，积怨已久。这一事件如果属实，背后反映的问题值得深思。首先，职务晋升问题及其背后的潜规则，是公安系统乃至整个公务员系统内的普遍现象。段鹏如果真因为职务晋升不公而采取极端手段，说明内部的晋升机制存在严重问题。其次，工作压力与人际关系的矛盾如若导致了段鹏的极端行为，折射出更加深层次的制度问题。一方面，公安系统工作压力巨大，尤其是在一线的特警和巡警，他们常常需要面对高危险、高强度的任务。另一方面，工作中的人际关系复杂，特别是在处理重大案件时，上级和下级之间的权力关系和沟通问题显得尤为突出。此外，事件的曝光及其在网络上的快速传播，也反映了信息控制和舆论引导之间的矛盾。一方面，官方媒体对这一事件的封锁，说明对于负面新闻的高度敏感。另一方面，网络用户和自媒体通过各种渠道进行信息传播，使得事件即使在封锁的情况下也能引起关注。这种现象表明，信息控制和舆论引导需要更加透明和有效的机制，而不是单纯的封禁和删除。最后，这一事件也让我们反思，社会在面对压力和不公时，如何提供一个更为健康和理性的解决途径。段鹏的极端行为，无论背后原因如何，都不可取。如何在制度上、心理干预上、社会支持上建立一套完整的体系，让一线工作人员能够在面对不公和压力时，有更为理性的途径来解决问题，是我们社会需要思考和改进的方向。总的来说，这一事件的真相尚未完全揭示，但它已经在网络上引发了广泛的讨论和思考。希望在接下来的时间里，官方能够给出一个明确的答案，解决公众的疑惑。同时，也希望通过这一事件，促使我们对现有制度和社会支持体系进行更为深入的反思和改进。
好了，以上就是今天热点深度所有内容，更多资讯可以关注六度简报网站，网址是6dobrief.com，在上面各位可以订阅各类符合您喜好的简报新闻，有免费套餐，也有更加专业的付费套餐供大家选择。今天的视频就到这里，我们下个视频再见。
First, why do you think the Chinese leadership came forth with this package and did so now? And secondly, you've been quite worried on the record about the growth of the China's trajectory for some time, with a focus on how the debt picture nationally and at the local level is a hard constraint on growth. Now, the Chinese stock markets responded positively just before China went on vacation. When China comes back from vacation, where do you think China's economy is going to head in the next few months? And is this the opening toward greater reform and stronger growth looking ahead?
Thank you, Scott, and thanks. Appreciate the invitation. Thanks to everyone for joining. I would just make sort of 3 points about what's happened sort of over the last week and a half or so. The first is that the need for policy support for the economy was obvious. It was building, and it was always going to likely take place over this September to October timeframe. And so why did there need to be some kind, and so it was a little earlier, I think, than some had expected, because a fiscal policy adjustment and a mid-year budget revision would usually happen in October. But at the same time, this is, I think that this is, there was a clear case for additional support. Why did I say that? First, credit growth was at an all-time low. We were already seeing credit weaken. We were seeing the price growth weaken. Credit was at, roughly about, bank asset growth was about 6.5% in around mid-year. These are among the lowest rates that had ever been posted. Same with household, TSF growth, as we had seen. Deflationary pressure was building within the economy. Consumption growth was extremely weak. And ironically, even though everyone had talked about the property sector as the most substantial source of weakness in China, it was actually starting to stabilize, and the real weakness in cyclical momentum in investment growth was from infrastructure and from local government spending as well. So there was clearly going to be a need for some sort of policy support. I think in terms of monetary easing, the Fed move provided China with a bit of a better opportunity to respond, as the constraints they face on monetary easing are usually tied to not only the pressure on the exchange rate, but the pressure on bank profitability. Second point I would make is that, what's the significance of all of these moves that have been taken? I mean, I think they're more about changing the range of expectations about policy, really, rather than the central tendency of where the economy is going. So this is, triggered this optimism in markets, which is logical, because it's made the government look more responsive to the downturn in cyclical momentum. And if you look at the PBOC presser that took place last Tuesday, a lot of it was very clearly focused on foreign investors and very clearly focused on the equity market in particular. The equity market is not, equities are not widely held within the Chinese system. It's not typically seen as a mechanism that would sort of boost the broader economy. But I think there was sort of an effort to try to generate some sort of positive confidence that would be readily apparent, and to show that you could try to recatalyze capital inflows into China's system. So, one anecdote from the press conference is that the Pan Gongsheng PBOC governor unveiled a new facility to lend directly to non-bank financial institutions for the purchases of shares or for buybacks of shares. And no one really asked about it at the press conference. So they planted a question with the Financial News, PBOC's newspaper, at the end of the press conference, and in order so that they could get out their talking points. So a lot of this, I think, was very externally driven toward the stock market specifically, and that is, I think, how you should interpret what has taken place. It's not that 20 or 30 basis points in interest rate cuts has a major impact on credit demand or a major impact on animal spirits. But what has adjusted is perhaps there will be a higher floor under cyclical momentum for the next year or so, and perhaps there's a greater range of policy support that can come online, which is the third point I would make, which is a lot depends upon the fiscal package that will follow this. Usually, a budget revision, China's only done one mid-year budget revision since the Asian financial crisis, and that was last year. Usually a mid-year budget revision would take place around, there has to be a National People's Congress standing committee to have that meeting to authorize that. That could occur at any time. Last year it occurred in mid-October. So a lot depends upon how this money, additional fiscal spending, will be spent. There are media reports out there from Reuters and Bloomberg saying that perhaps this could be a shift toward more consumption-oriented stimulus. And we don't really know exactly what that looks like. There have been numerous calls from within the Chinese system for transfer payments to households for many, many years. They have started to build back into a crescendo to fight deflationary pressure this year as well. If you believe the Reuters and Bloomberg reports, there's going to be roughly a 2 trillion kind of budget revision, which would be about 1.6% of GDP. But it depends how the money is spent. China is already running a significant fiscal deficit, including central and local governments are about 7 to 8% of GDP this year. Tax revenue is declining by about 5% so far this year. So, it raises the question of, yes, you can issue more bonds, but do you just want to pour money back into the same industrial policy priorities, or do you want to shift priority as well? There are some indications from media reports that there will be more consumer trade-in programs for durable goods. Those typically just sort of pull demand forward rather than really fundamentally shifting perceptions of incomes. But there's also the prospect that this could pave the way for a broader kind of system of transfer payments to Chinese consumers. So I think that's the significance of what we've seen so far.
Okay. Well, thank you, Logan. We're having a little bit of challenge with your microphone. We could hear everything you said. It just was occasionally got a little garbled. So if you just maybe work on that, change a battery or two, we'll come right back to you in just a little bit. So I'm going to turn now to Mary Lovely. And Mary, do you see more clear, definitive upside with this stimulus and expect it to have a more consequential effect than Logan just described? In particular, given your focus on international trade, what do you think this is going to mean for China's trade flows? Do you think this is going to lead to an increase in imports and hence helps boost global growth? Who are the likely international winners from this policy shift?
Okay, thanks, Scott. It's nice to be with this group on this important topic. I guess I agree with Logan. I don't see it having a more obvious effect until we see a bold fiscal package. This monetary stimulus is often termed a bold package, and in some way it is because we see them moving in it and basically making the signal that we've been waiting for, which is that they understand that the economy is really, I think, at kind of a knife edge. Logan mentioned the deflation. I think the deflation issue has finally hit the upper echelon of the party, and they're understanding that deflation can lead to a very negative cycle. So there's lots of folks watching this, including in Japan, and saying, haven't we done this? Didn't we learn lessons? So that's the good signal, but it's kind of weak tea given the problems that they face. I will talk specifically about the external sector because I think Logan's covered a lot of the ground on the package and what we need to look for next. On the external side, first of all, there's been a lot of concern in the West about China basically relying on net exports to grow out of this. And that, I think, was in some sense unwarranted concern because exports net are just not large enough to dig China out of this hole. China's exports as a share of GDP now are below 20%. That's fairly normal. It could, for a country of its size, it could be lower. But nevertheless, it's just not enough to dig them out. The second point about exports is that a lot of money is going into the new three, so focused on EVs and other green energy products. They're less than 5% of China's overall exports, even though they use up about 99% of our attention lately. The problem is not so much weakness there, but weakness in what we might think of as the old three. So apparel, furniture, and household appliances. And that's almost 10% of China's exports. And I would add more labor intensive. So it really speaks to the need for China to create jobs, I think, quickly as people's confidence continues to decline. Looking at just at exports since the pandemic, we have seen a very dramatic shift in where China is exporting. Its share of exports that go to high-income countries has been declining quite rapidly. Its share of exports to low and middle-income countries has been making up the slack. As many observers have noted, China's share of global exports really hasn't budged. That means they have to be going somewhere if they're being deflected from the West. That's a bit of a problem for China. First of all, these are different types of goods. Second of all, they almost surely have lower margins. And thirdly, they require new investments from Chinese firms and who can expect to have a lower rate of learning from penetrating these markets. So I think the Chinese officials would look at that and say, well, that's great. That's part of our outreach to the rest of the developing world. But from a commercial and growth perspective, I don't think that's a positive. So, and the last thing I want to mention is, of course, increasing geopolitical tensions. You mentioned at the top of this program, the tariffs going into effect in the vote we had this week in the EU to implement the tariffs. U.S. very likely to continue with more export controls to China, continuing its efforts to move supply chains away from China. I think part of the U.S. strategy so far has been to just put tons of uncertainty into global supply chains, and that is causing firms to move or at least create alternatives. And ultimately, that builds more competition for China. So I think that for all these reasons, we're not going to see the external sector coming to the rescue here. We're going to have a solid fiscal package to get the economy back on its feet.
Okay, so it's a good foot stomping that conclusion. Let me turn to Brian and see how things look from his world, because you advise a lot of institutional investors. You've been an institutional investor yourself. What's been the reaction that you've heard from folks that you've been talking with over the past 10 days? Might this make them more interested in re-expanding their investments toward China? And if not, what would be the signal they would need for their behavior to change?
Sure. Thanks, Scott. So let me start by noting that there's a real dichotomy between speculative investors at hedge funds and the like, and the more medium-term types who run long-only money at the big asset management shops. For some reason, among the hedge fund types, the Chinese equity market elicits FOMO like no other. Everyone is always afraid of missing a rally, perhaps because unlike most markets that tend to go up the stairs and down the elevator, Chinese stocks do tend to go down the stairs and up the elevator, and catching an elevator ride like we've seen in the last week or so is pretty alluring. So when we get a policy signal like we did last week, that speculative crowd is always ready to pounce. But I would point out that while this rally is pretty spectacular, this is the fourth time since 2021 that this crowd has tried to jump on the bandwagon for the next big bull run in Chinese stocks. Now, of course, the hedge fund types tend to be contrarian investors, and their bullishness in part stems from the fact that the long-only folks at the big asset management companies have tended to run underweight Chinese equities in recent years. And I suspect the more pertinent question for our audience today is whether these folks are going to chase the price action and get more involved in Chinese equities. And I'm skeptical that that's going to happen. For one thing, being underweight Chinese equities has been the right trade over the past 3 years or so. But more importantly, most of these investors are underweight because they believe some version of the type of story that people like Logan and I have been telling over the past few years. So let me quickly give you my version of that story to explain why I think the more medium-term investors are going to have to see a lot more than we saw last week to get re-engaged with China. So we should be clear that as far as the stimulus goes, we don't yet have the critical piece of information, which is the size of the fiscal stimulus. So we have the Reuters story from last week, quoting unnamed sources, suggesting they would announce $2 trillion in special bonds into year end. That compares to the $1 trillion they did last year. It would take us from a slightly contractionary fiscal stance to one that's slightly expansionary on a central level. However, these more speculative investors I talked to are getting somewhat carried away, with many now looking for the announcement of a stimulus in the 5 to 10 trillion yuan range. This speculation is largely driven by comments from a couple of think tank professors recently, pushing for a 10 trillion yuan stimulus. So I'm going to note two of these professors who have made a splash with these recommendations, but they differ on how the money should be spent, which I think is very telling and gets to the heart of the real problem with a mega stimulus policy. So Jia Kang, affiliated with the Minister of Finance formerly, he heads the China Academy of New Supply Side Economics, advocates a 10 trillion stimulus to be spent on infrastructure mega projects, which he acknowledges openly will show very low economic returns. Liu Shijin, Deputy Director of the China Development Research Fund, suggests a 10 trillion stimulus to be spent on raising the level of public services and investments in education, healthcare, and social welfare. So one recommends infrastructure, the other consumption. Now, in my view, expenditure on that scale in either infrastructure or social benefits presents problems for Xi Jinping that outweigh the benefits to him. So in the wake of the housing bust, it's clear that the Chinese system is capable of wasting resources on a world historical scale. To many of us, this has been clear for some time, and to Xi Jinping's credit, it became clear to him, which is why he chose to burst the housing bubble. Now, everyone also knows that China has reached the point of diminishing returns on infrastructure investments, so that those investments are largely now make-work programs. And again, Jia Kang himself acknowledges this. So a return to large-scale infrastructure stimulus would essentially be an admission of defeat on the part of Xi Jinping, an open acknowledgement that his efforts to transition away from that growth model are failing. Furthermore, openly returning to an economic paradigm which everyone can now see is a dead end is extremely dangerous. It could damage Xi's personal credibility, and there's a big question as to whether the markets would see it as credible. I think you could see potentially serious instability in the currency, which, as we all know, is the last thing Chinese policymakers want. So infrastructure stimulus is dangerous. I don't think they're going to go down that path. That leaves the possibility of a large consumption stimulus, which I also think is highly risky from a political perspective, in the sense that it's ultimately incompatible with the way the Chinese economy is built to function. So the Chinese supply side is built primarily to execute upon central plans. Handing large sums of money to consumers effectively hands to the household sector the ultimate say in the allocation of capital, because capital will need to go to produce the things that households want to consume, or you'll simply have massive bottlenecks, huge inflation, and a rapid deterioration in the trade deficit. So the Chinese supply side is not set up to make that pivot in rapid fashion. And furthermore, the CCP is unlikely to want to hand that power to households, because if they start down this track of subsidizing consumption to prop up growth, it's a treadmill they can't ever exit without things just immediately falling apart again. Because this is not a short-term speed bump that this economy is dealing with. It is dealing with a multi-decade economic paradigm that has effectively fallen apart. And Xi Jinping has enunciated a clear vision of what comes next. It's what he calls high quality development, which is still a centrally planned investment-led growth model, but his hope is it for it to be a less corrupt, more efficient process of allocating capital to higher value-added sectors. Xi has also been quite clear that this transition is going to be painful. So while Chinese authorities clearly do not want to see the bottom fall out of the economy and will expand central government borrowing to backfill spending shortfalls at the local level, a 5 to 10 trillion yuan boosting of demand, which would have to be repeated and sustained for a number of years, would put the Chinese economy on a path that I do not think Xi Jinping will want to go down. And furthermore, I think he sees more strategic uses for these resources than to keep the household sector fat and happy. So to sum up, a stimulus on the order of 2 to 3 trillion makes a lot more sense to me than a mega stimulus. So I think there is a lot of scope for the market to be disappointed later this month when we start to get a sense for how big this package is going to be. Thanks.
Brian, that's super, super helpful, going through the details of the options, potential options, and the consequences of each of them, and the logic. That was amazingly valuable. Craig, the stimulus package has several components, and more to be named. What do you think could be most effective? Some of the things that Brian mentioned, or other things that you'd be looking for? Relatedly, most surveys of foreign companies in China, including by the U.S.-China Business Council, show a drop in their outlook for future opportunities in China. And there's been some amount of diversification, or at least new marginal investment has been heading elsewhere instead of to China. Is this stimulus the potential trigger for a turnaround in sentiment and behavior by multinationals and American companies in China? Or what other steps would multinationals and American firms in China and in boardrooms at headquarters want to see before reassessing their current China strategies?
Well, terrific, Scott, and what a great conversation thus far. For me, this moment is very reminiscent of Tokyo in 1995, and so please forgive me if I reference that a few times in my opening comments here. At least in my view, the Chinese government has had five objectives in the recent program. Firstly, to stabilize the property market. Secondly, to prop up the stock market. Third, to boost liquidity and encourage lending. Fourth, to support local governments. And the most important one, which all the other speakers have alluded to, is to set the stage for the fiscal stimulus, which we all expect is coming. So let me make just a couple of comments on each of the five objectives of the stimulus program. Real estate is an enormous part of the economy, and I think that the measures taken have been pretty significant to decrease mortgages, reduce down payments, funding unfinished projects. And then Guangdong immediately, and later Beijing and Shanghai, released purchasing restrictions on real estate. We have to remember that 70% of Chinese household wealth is in real estate. And so this is really important. I suspect that additional Chinese housing will come onto the market, and that's a good thing and a bad thing. It's great that these projects are finished, but adding to the supply without addressing to the demand is going to lead to, or could lead to, a continuation of downward pressure on housing prices. And here again, I look at Japan, where housing prices have gone down pretty consistently for a very long time. And I wonder what the increase in supply and the, if you will, balance or even reduction in demand is going to do to prices and thus household wealth. Let me talk about the stock market a little bit. We have seen an impressive pop, and I won't go through the numbers here. But those who were lucky enough to hold Chinese shares have been richly rewarded, notwithstanding no fundamental change in the economy or in corporate strategy. So that's great if you own Chinese stocks. But again, I look at Japan as a useful model. And I recall very clearly in 1995, 6, 7, when the Japanese Ministry of Finance and the Bank of Japan were engaged in furious stock purchasing operations. At that time, we called them PKOs, not peacekeeping operations, but price-keeping operations. And this definitely leads to a bump in the market, but the bump was only temporary because the fundamentals had not changed. So let's see what happens over Chinese share prices over the medium and the longer term. And I compliment Brian on his excellent analysis there. Let's talk a little bit about boosting liquidity. I think that the steps of the central bank were bold and very clear, significant, and welcome. So now the banks have plenty of money to lend, but are there borrowers? And the key test here will be not the decline in lending rates, but will there be a booming borrowing and a spurt of either investment or consumption by the private sector, either consumers or private companies over the near term? So let's see. I think in economics, we also have to be aware of the trade-offs here. And for example, Chinese insurance companies largely derive their income through the interest rates on government bonds. those revenues have just gone down. So let's remember the trade-offs here and consider potential fragility within the Chinese financial institutions. Couple words on supporting local governments. There's no doubt that local governments and provincial governments have a huge amount of fiscal problems. There's a great deal of variation across China on this subject, but generally the picture is bleak and it's getting worse. They need transfers from the central government. Everyone realizes that these transfers alone are not effective over the longer term, but structurally, the probability of putting in an income tax, a real estate tax, or other revenue boosting mechanisms at the local or provincial level, very unclear prospects there. Certainly, the imposition of a real estate tax would not be opportune right now, given declining prices in real estate. So I understand that many local provincial governments are selling assets. That's probably a good thing, but again, it's only helpful over the short term and not the medium and the longer term. So let me add to the debate about the fiscal stimulus. I suspect that later in October, we might hear from the NPC, and we might have a better idea on how they're going to spend that money. What I think matters the most really is not how much money is spent, but where the fiscal stimulus goes. One-off cash transfers are very inefficient, as most of the money will be saved. I completely agree that additional investment in infrastructure will lead to diminishing returns. Really, what I would love to see is if the central government were to begin the process of structural reform of the social safety welfare net, increasing pensions, providing the Chinese, rural Chinese, with health care, give Liudong Renko, give the floating population unemployment insurance, improving health care and education, particularly in the rural areas, and also getting rid of hukou restrictions once and for all. The real problem within the Chinese economy, the root cause, is a lack of confidence, and only by addressing the gap in the social safety welfare net will the Chinese people and Chinese businesses feel confident enough to invest and spend again. So the lesson of Japan 1994, 1995 is don't let a good crisis go to waste. Use the crisis in a way to address the structural problems. And I think vis-a-vis American, European, and indeed I would say Chinese companies, that they're going to take a wait-and-see attitude here. Whether or not the reforms will lead to greater structural growth over the medium and the longer term, and they will invest accordingly. Thank you.
Thank you. Wow. I got one word answer to Craig to what you just said. Amen. Amen. That was fantastic. Everybody's terrific. I've got a gajillion questions I want to ask. Let me ask just two of them. And feel free to jump on in and tackle these. The first question in the short term, what's the one economic indicator you're looking to see that this stimulus package is biting, it's having the kind of effect you think it needs to? Obviously, stock market's already shifted, and maybe that's enough for hedge fund investors. But is there other things? I'll tell you my favorite. It's new home purchases. People willing to hand over money to buy a home that doesn't exist. I wonder if people have a different one. But I'm curious, what's the statistic you're looking at that you want to see? Second is to go back to a point that Craig made at the end, which is because we went 35 minutes without hearing the word structural, and I'm glad that Craig brought it up. So beyond the fiscal and where that money is going to go, what do we need to see in terms of structural reform, and do we need to see the stimulus align with structural reform? So he mentioned the social safety net and education and hukou, property taxes, income taxes, maybe bankruptcy reform, so that losers lose. A lot of those things that I just mentioned, that he mentioned, actually may in the short term be contractionary, but they may be really important to do no matter what. And I guess one of the things that comes from the Japanese experience is the earlier the better, the later the worse. Delaying reform just makes the problem much, much more difficult to deal with. All right, I've thrown a couple things on the table because you all really generated me thinking quite a bit. So why don't we go back to Logan first, and then others who want to jump in, please go ahead.
Sure, thanks, Scott. And if there's problems with my microphone, apologies. I'll try to jump back in. I mean, I think the one economic indicator I would look for at this point is, it's not one, but it is indicative, something that would be indicative of household incomes and willingness to spend improving. And that could be either core CPI, which has been trending lower ever since the deleveraging campaign in 2016, 2018. That could be some other element of household consumption, because the slowdown in China has materialized even within the official data in nominal growth, in trade imbalances, the fall in Chinese imports in particular, and in the weakness in prices. Which is consistent, of course, with nominal growth. So that's sort of what I would be looking for. Let me just comment a little bit about the property market, because I think we have a slightly idiosyncratic view here, before addressing some of the structural questions. I mean, I think that the problem in the property market is actually very different depending upon where you are in China. In several interior cities, the problem is too much supply, no net in-migration, and considerable inventories as far as the eye can see that will probably never be absorbed and will probably need to be written off. The problem in coastal cities that are still seeing population inflows is ironically the opposite. No one's built anything for 2 to 3 years. And the demand is primarily from upgraders. So people who want larger homes but can't get out of their existing homes in order to upgrade. And so ironically, sell-through rates on some of these projects are pretty good. So what's available for sale is just not actually fitting the demands of most of what is there. And so it's going to take a little while for that adjustment to take place. But what you already see is land sales picking back up in many of these cities, which is indicative likely of an eventual stabilization in property construction, even as overall price levels start to continue falling. And so there is some level of equilibrium demand in China's housing market. We think it's somewhere between 550 and 750 million square meters a year, which would be about 35 to 45% of the peak levels, which was new starts at 1.71 billion square meters. But we're already down 66% in terms of annualized new starts from the peak. That happened in 3 years. It took Japan roughly 15 years to have the same pace of adjustment. So ironically, you may see property construction stabilize, because of this mismatch in supply and demand, even as broader price and financial adjustments occur elsewhere within the property market. On the structural questions, let me just say a couple of things. I think that the debate about why consumption growth is limited in China comes down to sort of 4 different arguments or 4 different views. The first is that it is based on the share of household income as a proportion of the economy, the sort of Michael Pettis view. The second is that it's based on the income inequality in the economy, the sort of Ganli China Household Finance Survey or Thomas Piketty type view. The third is that it's based on the level of household debt. And the fourth is that it's based on precautionary savings and the absence of a saving, a social safety net as such. I mean, all of these probably contribute to some extent, but it's very hard to see how you address the first two, the low household income share of GDP and the inequality and distribution of Chinese income, without a significant restructuring of the entire fiscal system. China only collects fiscal revenue based on investment-led growth. They collect value-added tax, they collect enterprise income tax. They do not collect much in domestic consumption tax nor individual income tax. And there are things you can do to You can't really cut individual income tax to promote consumption. You could cut the payroll tax, but that would create different, and the social security contributions, but that would create different deficits therein. The broader structural constraint here is you need to figure out another source of income, fiscal income of about 5 to 6% of GDP, which is exactly what China's lost from 2015 to 2024 over the last 9 years, to replenish and potentially change the patterns of distribution of fiscal income. By our calculations, for example, if you just cut the rural savings rate in half overnight and somehow through some sort of magic wand, that would only free up about 0.6% of annual spending, of GDP and annual spending. This really is an income problem. And the only way to address that is through the fiscal system. That's all. Sorry, went on too long.
That's super helpful. Others who want to talk about the short-term indicators, Brian, or long-term? Yeah, Brian, go ahead.
Yeah. I wanted to try to cut in front of Logan there because I thought he was going to steal my indicator. I thought for sure he would say credit growth. So to me, that's sort of the be-all and end-all for the Chinese economy in a cyclical sense. And I long thought, like, geez, if credit growth ever sort of goes to single digits, this economy is just not going to sustain itself. And it clearly seems to be the case because obviously there's a lot of bad debt hidden in the system that needs to be rolled. And, Craig mentioned Japan in the mid 90s. And if you look at the experience in Japan, in that case, persistent large budget deficits in the context of a strong currency did not work to get them out of the no nominal GDP rut, because in a debt deflation, particularly in the wake of an asset bust, you reveal a lot of debt as unserviceable. The people holding that debt don't want to borrow anymore. Nominal growth slows. China's in deflation, and that further disincentivizes borrowing, and you're in sort of a vicious cycle. And in China, I think there's another problem where the lower bound on interest rates probably isn't zero because of the prevalence of household deposits. They're going to need to pay those people one something, I would suspect. So they're in a classic debt deflation trap. If you look at like the Ray Dalio beautiful deleveraging, it's some of the real losses get allocated, but you can't allocate the entire real loss. You need to reflate and inflate away some portion of that. And in my mind, that involves a currency devaluation. And this is the intractable problem in China because there's no way to do that without a huge mess. So to bring it back to the fiscal stimulus piece, what we saw in Japan was expanding government deficits just to keep total non-financial credit flat over that period because the private sector retreated and the government kept coming in to fill that hole to sort of sustain things. And I think that is the pattern we're going to see in China. Now, for this stimulus to really be effective in changing the trajectory of economic growth, you would have to see it push that credit growth, do more than just make up for the decline in borrowing on the local government and private sector level, but do more than that, get that credit growth, back up to 10% something. And for that, you are talking well above 5 trillion yuan. So I don't think that's likely. And again, the stricture here is the soft peg to the dollar, which makes solving all of these problems difficult, if not impossible. I'll leave the structural stuff to others.
Yeah, Craig and Mary, there's indicators that you guys are looking for?
Well, I'm concerned about housing prices and the effect that has on confidence. We have seen declines in housing prices for a while. I appreciated Logan and Brian's comments on that, but I suspect we don't know where the bottom is on housing prices. Be it in Harbin or Guizhou or Beijing, Shanghai. And I agree that they will all be different. But given the concentration of family and household wealth in housing prices, if we have a continued long-term decline in housing prices, we're going to have a continued long-term decline in consumer confidence. And I don't know where that floor is. And that is the biggest concern I would have. Related to that, we haven't mentioned deflation yet, but I do think that the decline in prices is a concern. and it's something that should be watched very closely. The IMF does not seem concerned about deflation, but I think that there are indicators that need to be watched and that should be addressed if we see increasing trends towards overall price declines. So those are the two numbers I would be concerned about.
Mary?
Yeah, I would agree with Craig on the deflation. All of these indicators are obviously really important to keep an eye on, but the deflation, I think one reason why we haven't heard as much about it is I think that the leadership just didn't want to talk about it. You talk to Chinese economists and they were basically, their lips were sealed until recently. So if you look 5 quarters of, falling PPI, I think is a real problem. It's not in all sectors, but this reflects weak job growth. So there is the importance of, as Craig mentioned, the fact that people's assets are very heavily into housing, but they still have to earn a living. And unless those jobs are forthcoming, and that includes people coming into the labor force, so all the graduates last year that are still partially or unemployed, as well as migrants to the city, this is a big problem for them. When I was just in China, people were talking a lot about the insecurity caused by the weak social safety net. A lot of concern, for example, about healthcare and incomes for parents. This is for working age people who are supporting parents or worrying about the uptick in cancer, for example, in China. This is a real concern for people who are in the prime of their earning life. So I also agree that this idea of structural reform and beginning the process through healthcare reform and pension reform is really important. But that leads me back to Brian's, I think, insight, which is, will the leadership really allow consumers to drive this boat? You'd be spending a lot more money on healthcare. You'd be putting a lot more investment into healthcare. You'd be putting a lot of money into the hands of elderly people who might want to spend it on entertainment or travel. And that seems incompatible with a regime that is, looking at this transition to the new productive forces as existential. It's not going to get them more robots. It's not going to raise TFP. So I feel that what we've been calling, they're stuck. It's a stuck transition. They're out of sync. The old has to die. The new has to be born. But in the middle, it's just a lot of pain. And I think what we're seeing with this bold announcement is that the pain that Xi Jinping promised everybody is actually probably bigger than he might have imagined. And secondly, no growth equals lack of stability. If they're focusing on stability, as everyone tells us, they're finding that they can't do that without having growth. So it's really a very interesting time to be watching the Chinese economy. That's all I can. There's just so many questions that have to be answered.
Well, let me ask you all a couple more. Those are great answers to the questions I did ask, but let me push one on domestic and one on the international. So, because this gets to something that you all have been raising, which is about the balance of power within China's political economy and whose interests are being served. And I think it was Logan who mentioned there needs to be a transfer of wealth toward workers. Well, one way to do that, obviously, the metric is raising wages. One way to get that is actually genuinely empower workers, right? Give them way more authority and leverage to negotiate wages. That might come through a whole variety of different kinds of mechanisms. We've not discussed here youth unemployment, which one of our audience members raised. Maybe we didn't discuss it because it's hard to find that piece of data in Chinese data anymore, but it's quite high. So at the entry level workers are amazingly concerned about their job opportunities, and folks at the other end, retirees, are worried. The adjustments in the retirement age were quite limited and only going to be phased in for a long time, but you've got to address those concerns as well. So I was curious, what do you think about the challenges of China's economy with regard to workers and labor? The second is on the international side. This highlights to me the contradictions between and trade-offs in trying to achieve different kinds of goals. If you had greater net exports, that would go to the bottom line of growth, but that would upset a whole bunch of trading partners, right? And so it seemed to me one way to, you might choose instead to increase imports and try and figure out how to smooth over relations with the United States and others, because actually another source of uncertainty and low confidence in China is the unpredictability of global tensions and how long those might last. Of course, if you follow Brian's advice and say what you need is to weaken the RMB, that goes against that goal. So what should be the priority on the international side, to boost exports or boost imports and kiss and make up with the West? So both kinds of questions, one on the domestic side, one on the international side. I want to turn to Craig first on those.
Well, I would argue that the key here is to empower the Chinese private sector and to expand the service sector. The one thing that we have not seen in this batch of fiscal or monetary stimulus, and which we did not see in the third plenum, was reform of the state-owned enterprise system at the central government level. Now, I mentioned that there's asset sales at the local level and the provincial level, but we're not seeing that at the central government level. And at least in my view, that's an essential part of the package here, to give the private Chinese companies room to grow. SOEs need to be preferably sold off, but if not, disciplined to provide their returns back to the Chinese people and give private sector Chinese companies and multinationals more room to grow, to allow for more competitive markets in China, not those dominated by a few major SOE players. So I think that without that element of reform, you're not going to be able to find the equilibrium that you're looking for. Also, you know, if manufacturing and services, compared, Chinese has an Arnold Schwarzenegger-like manufacturing torso on a Woody Allen-like services legs, and it's not really working well. The service industry can be expanded very significantly, and foreign players can play an important role in doing that. So I look at those three, I guess, sets of reforms as being critical. Thank you.
All right. Who else wants to jump in here? Mary.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great jumping off point, Craig. I think that, Craig's absolutely right. When we look at the SOEs, I think it reflects a bigger problem, which is a failure to actually address the political economy that's leading to the economy being stuck. And, in the United States, we see the same issue. You have, for example, some legacy companies that don't see the future as being for them. And then we have to kind of find a way forward politically to create new industries. But, we're seeing it with a failure to really scale down steel. Now, the developers, what are we going to do? We have to buy them off, or, how much of their capital will be preserved in this process. We know eventually the households will end up eating the debt. All that process has to be done. It's a huge political economy problem. So as is disciplining the SOEs, which is vitally important, because competition, entry, and exit, of course, was the secret sauce for China. And we've seen those metrics decline. I think it's also, you say, should we boost exports, boost imports? Well, of course, those are largely made by private decisions. And so they can't, unless you're thinking about the phase one deal where you magically wave a wand and supposedly increase Chinese imports, which of course never materialized, you have to set the stage for how that's going to happen. And I think part of that is by making these structural reforms in the private sector and in the SOE sector to get that going, as well as decreasing tensions. And clearly, tackling some of these political economy questions would, I think, show that the Chinese understand that the West is not going to allow certain things like that happened in the past, for example, in solar, to happen in EV or other sectors, and may reduce the tension. So something structural, I think, is necessary to bring as an olive branch to the rest of the world. Just telling them that, everybody needs EVs is just really not working, and yet they continue to double down on that.
Yeah. Brian Logan?
Yeah, Brian, I'll be very brief if that's all right. I mean, I think that, Scott, you asked, these questions are very much linked, because a lot of the problems of China's political economy at this point and the distributional issues that affect workers, especially younger workers, are very much related to this persistence in investment-led growth that generates international tensions. And the problem here is that Beijing likes to describe these pains that are going on as transitional when you're moving to new growth drivers in which the labor force will adjust. Many of these new growth drivers are not very labor intensive. They are very automated industries. They're very capital intensive industries. The question remains, what happens after that? And this is the broader problem that, just picking up on what Mary started with and comments just now, which is that China is one of the world's largest sources of investment. It's about 26% of global investment, only 12% by our calculations of global consumption. So if you remain an investment-led economy and you're expanding, the only way in which that can work and China can grow relative to the rest of the world is either to have other countries disinvest or go out of business, or to gain global export market share. That's exactly why this strategy is so confrontational at this point, and you're seeing the kind of resistance you are to China's approach, and why some sort of structural down payment and discussing these issues in different ways, rather than just saying we are pursuing an investment-led growth strategy focused on advanced manufacturing, is going to be necessary to prevent trade tensions from intensifying.
Brian?
Just some quick points. I know we're nearing the top of the hour. There was a Caixin article this week about, I think it was the first state-owned construction company defaulting. So the labor force problems are going to be severe and persistent, because, this real estate bust is unfolding in waves. This could be several years. So, the developers are gone to a large extent. These construction companies have been paid in empty apartments, and then the suppliers to the construction companies are next. And I don't think Xi Jinping has any choice but to gamble that the rest of the world will accept Chinese imports, because he absolutely needs to sustain that base of employment. And I'm not convinced it's a bad bet. Just as an aside, if Donald Trump should get reelected, I think he's not going to focus on China in the first couple of years in what could be a tenuous domestic economic environment, and a lot of other things he wants to get done that are economically destabilizing. So somewhat counterintuitively, I think, she could catch a break there for a couple of years. And, the European auto tariffs are not nothing, but they're not really going to change the calculus. So I think, continuing to pump exports is really all he can do, because to sort of sum up the discussion we've had today, there's this chasm between what China should do to fix this thing and what they can do given the self-imposed constraints on how they run the system. And there's just really no solving that one. So, I think they're going to have to continue to export at a high rate. It's all they have.
This has been a terrific conversation, extremely informative on a whole number of levels. I think what this shows is that the actions that the Chinese took in the last week of September have changed the conversation. That now we are talking about the beginning of trying to not just get the economy started and growing, but what else needs to be done. And you all outlined what needs to be done on the fiscal side, as well as on the structural side, which they still need to fill in the blanks. And how they fill in those blanks is going to matter a lot. because it's going to really, that will be what changes the behavior of Chinese consumers, the private sector, foreign institutional investors, as well as foreign governments and others. So they've turned a page. We're going to look to see what the next chapters look like to understand where the economy is going to go. At the same time, yes, as Brian said, they face a whole variety of constraints, economic and political. So they're going to need to be more creative than they've been in how they write this story to really fundamentally change expectations. That does mean tough medicine, but it may be the medicine that they need.
欢迎来到6度解析，新闻背后的多维思考，带你洞悉头条背后的世界。在今日华尔街频道的6度解析中，我们将深入探究时事热点，为你揭开新闻背后的真相。在这个信息泛滥、真相难觅的时代，6度解析应运而生。我运用海量数据、人工智能整合以及专家观点，层层剥析每个故事，通过实时背景数据挖掘，确保你获得全面的新闻资讯。然而，我们关注的不仅仅是数据，更重要的是将它们串联起来。我将分析多方视角，揭示隐藏的脉络，为你提供单一媒体常常忽略的背景信息。无论是政治、经济，还是全球事务，我都将为你带来最具洞察力的分析。试想一下，拥有洞悉全局的能力，做出明智的决策，参与有意义的讨论，这就是6度解析带给你的价值。它不仅仅是新闻分析，更是一种赋能的工具。加入今日华尔街的6度解析，共同探索头条背后的故事。你通往深度理解的旅程，从这里开始。不要只是阅读新闻，要解码新闻，理解新闻，活出新闻。这一切尽在6度解析。立即订阅，不错过任何真知灼见。因为了解真相仅仅是个开始。